year. Um, just in case you don't know, we're the New Zealand Student Space Association Christchurch, and we're a new club on campus. Right, so today's event is an Ask Me Anything session with Professor David Wiltshire. Yeah, I'll just leave it up to him then. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So, I'm David Wiltshire. My mountain is Taranaki. I was born near there, but my river is Manawatu because I grew up in Palmerston North. But actually, my forebears first came to Christchurch in the 1880s. And I was told that I'm supposed to speak about careers, and I didn't quite know whether that was my career or careers in physics or just careers in general that physicists do. So what I'm going to tell you about, first of all, is the shape of my career and the shape of other people's careers, because not everyone, there are too many different role models, and I don't think that I'm a particular role model for anything, because everyone is pretty individualistic. So I'm a theoretical physicist. So you make a choice to become a theoretical physicist. I made the choice at the age of 14. Now, I was an amateur astronomer at that point, and I was very heavily into science fiction. And I just happened to pick up a science fiction novel one day, and I realized, okay, that character is obviously so much like me. Clearly, that's the way I think. Obviously, I must be a physicist. So, and we happened to be doing an English project at school on work. So I decided, okay, and we had to go and interview someone about their work. So I went and interviewed the local lecturer, who was Paul Callaghan. Happened to be a friend of my father because they were in the Labour Party, and they were both activists. And this is obviously a photo of Paul when he's much older, because there's a whiteboard, and whiteboards didn't exist in those days, it was blackboards. Anyway, Paul became my mentor. You need a mentor. I mean, it's good to have a mentor. It's not always necessary, but it's good to. And so the following year, being an amateur astronomer, I subscribed to the Sky and Telescope, and there was an article by one Dennis Overby, before Dennis Overby became famous as a New York Times columnist, in Sky and Telescope about the evaporation of black holes. And I decided, well, that's obviously very cool. I really would like, that's where I'm going to go. So it was about Stephen Hawking and his recent discovery. So okay, that's where I want to go to study eventually. Now, getting there was very difficult. The following year, I was a very precocious brat, and I got my sister to buy me this book, Large-Scale Structure of Space-Time, for my 16th birthday. I understood the first page, the introduction I could understand, then one page of that I could follow, and but that was it really, because there's parts of that book I still find difficult to understand. But anyway, I went and I did a science fair project. So I borrowed Paul Callaghan's computer account. And in those days, my idea was, okay, let's go and look at the sky at a nearby star and see how the positions of the stars change. And Paul said, well, why don't you see what happens when you go close to the speed of light? So Paul was always one for pushing you a little bit. And he obviously thought I could do that. So I went and worked out how to make that possible. And in those days, computers were different, right? So this is before the personal computers, when we had punch cards and decks of cards, but they had the first green screens. And so what I did was I made a film taken one frame at a time on Super 8mm, it was 8mm film, and working out what happens when you travel to a nearby star near the speed of light. it was quite a challenge. It was fun. It took 45 seconds to compute one frame in that, and we had to take off the screen in order to reduce the glare. We had to actually unscrew parts of the computer monitor. So anyway, looking back on it, I actually it was actually all correct, apart from one fact and Paul didn't know enough special relativity to correct this mistake I made between future and past pointing vectors. So actually I was looking out the wrong window of my spacecraft, but I was really traveling in the opposite direction to what I thought I was traveling. But apart from that little problem, it was actually all correct, and it was a long time before computer simulate. That you can do things that you can do today with computers. This was a long time ago. So anyway, I won the local Manawatu Science Fair, and I got to go to the Phillips New Zealand Science Fair. I didn't get a prize there, but I met a lot of interesting people, including people in the New Zealand Spaceflight Association, and so. A lot of things in your career happen by chance, and so one person I met at the ANZUS conference chose to come to Canterbury because I told her that you could come and do astrophysics here, and so. I had my career, so I want to give a counterpoint because I knew very early on what I wanted to do, but lots of people don't. And you can always make mistakes and do things differently and find things out and change what you're doing. So Vicky Hyde, she's now a UC legend. She founded a student club called Chaos, which a few of you might know about. So I was there when it was founded, back in those days. She came here initially intending to do astrophysics, but failed most of her courses the first year. And so she decided to do something else, and she became a science communicator and has done a lot of things, New Zealand skeptic. So she's now Order of New Zealand Merit, this, that, and the other. So that's another career path, and so if you don't always make the right choice, but it's easy to change, especially when you're early on in your career, and you've got to try some different things and find out what's for you, right? So, I think I'm a bad role model in the sense that I always knew what I wanted to do, and I stuck to it. It was pretty hard along the way, but that's not everybody. So, at Canterbury, then there are a lot of people who were influential. One of them is Roy Kerr, who discovered the black hole solution, and Roy, the solution that describes rotating black holes. And Roy was a legend as not a particularly good lecturer. And I've got a lot of stories about that, and you can ask me those questions if you want, but you can also, I've got a lecture on that at the Swedish Academy of Sciences website. So Roy was awarded the Crawford Prize, the equivalent of the Swedish Academy who give out the Nobel Prize for physics say this is their equivalent for astronomy. So, and he got that a few years ago, and I gave a lecture at the symposium, and there are a lot of Roy Kerr stories in there. But one thing that Roy Kerr said was that he told me, I'll never get a job in relativity, I should go and do condensed matter physics, because relativity is really hard to get positions in because it's not that applied. So it's very competitive because it's a lot of fun if you like doing interesting fundamental physics, but it's very difficult to get a job. I ignored him on that point. And I proved him wrong, and he's lucky I proved him wrong because not so many years ago, I organised a big birthday conference for him when he was 70, and then a lot of people realised that actually he's still alive, because they'd assumed he was dead, and then he started getting all these invitations to go around the world giving lectures, so he's lucky that I didn't follow his advice. So I didn't actually choose Roy for a supervisor. I had another supervisor for my honours project. So I was doing mathematics and physics in equal measure up to that point. And the supervisor I chose was Noel Doherty, who I'd actually met first at that ANZUS conference, which followed after the science fair, where I first met a lot of people, including Vicky from the New Zealand Spaceflight Association. So Noel had also spoken at our astronomical club in Palmerston North, and so I knew Noel from way back, and Noel was a great supervisor. He wasn't the world's #1 researcher, but he was actually a really good supervisor, and he's the people who are less famous, you can't even find their photo on the internet anymore, but that's his textbook, which I still use, which I still reference. So anyway, I did an MSc, so in between, so I finished my honours degree, I did an MSc. At that point, I got the scholarship to go to Cambridge, and that was very difficult to get that scholarship. And when I got to Cambridge, I suffered from something which a lot of people suffer from at some point in their career, and that's called Impostor Syndrome. So we didn't have any name for the stuff that you go through, but at some point, when you're really trying to push yourself always to your limit, you get into a situation where everybody is talking and you think, how did I get here? I'm not meant to be here. Because all these people are speaking this strange language and I don't understand what they're saying. And it was that situation coming from Canterbury to Cambridge because we don't have the resources to put on the courses that they do. And they already had a general relativity course in 3rd year, and their 4th year, which they call Part 3 for the logical reason that 2nd year is Part 1B. And there are lots of little... Cambridge is one of those ancient institutions which has all these little things, and you've got to come to understand all the different ways of speaking and all the little quaint quirks and things. Anyway, at that stage, they were taking 3 students a year into the relativity group, and 2 of them had to go through Part 3, the 4th year course, which there's special courses on black holes and special courses on this and that and the other, most of which I hadn't done. But because it was very difficult to get scholarships to do Part 3, they took 1 student a year from the whole world who hadn't done Part 3. So it was very competitive to get in there. And I thought, oh gosh, I just got this by fluke, probably because someone I knew happened to know Stephen Hawking's wife, right? And she put in a good word for me, Jane, right? And so I was really feeling out of my depth there. And I wasn't sure what I wanted to do for a research topic, and I had to decide it within 6 weeks of arriving at the same time as doing all of these courses to catch up. And so there were 2 of us, me and Jonathan, so there was either you did quantum cosmology and you worked with Stephen, or you did supergravity and worked with Gary. And so the question came one day from Stephen, what do you want to work on? I knew Jonathan so wanted to work on wanted to work with Stephen rather than necessarily quantum cosmology. Would worked on whatever Stephen was working on just to work with Stephen, and I was just feeling so out of my depth, so I said, I'll do supergravity. So, and I don't think that I really ever regret that. My life would have been very different. And so one thing in your career is that there are random things that happen that will change everything. You know, it's the beauty of the universe is that it's indeterministic, and there are all these contingent things. And anyway, so I decided that I would work on supergravity. It didn't really actually make much difference from the point of view of being in the group, because Gary was the one who really led the group in this. I mean, Stephen was the leader, but Gary, because Stephen was in a wheelchair with all the stuff, for practical purposes, his closest associate, Gary, was the one who took part in all the decisions, and in fact, they did a lot of their best work together. So, and it was a very tight-knit group. So, and of course, this was a very remarkable time, and it's very strange when you get on a plane and there's a movie showing, and you know what actually happened, and 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 you get a real deep insight into Hollywood, because they take characters, they strip things down just to have a few essential things. They got a lot of things wrong, like there were women, we wore jeans, people had different hair. It was not, there were a lot of things that weren't right in that movie, but they got some of the essentials of the characters right, and they got some of the events right, even if they were in the wrong order. And so, I'm happy you're recording this. I'm not going to answer every question, maybe. Depends what you ask. Right. Anyway, so that was an interesting time. And so what I was just going to play a clip, because there are actual things from that era. I can find many things. So here's a little clip from what it was actually, and this is from 1985. It must have been a week I was away. I think I was probably walking in the hills in Wales that week. It was in summer, just before a conference, and they're really into the
Department of Mathematics and Theoretical Physics is housed in a creaking old building.
That's how it was.
The Cambridge University Press. T and differential equations seem to share table space about equally. Hawking has about half a dozen postgraduate students working with him at any given time.
None of the ones in that picture.
Assisting him with his work and helping him about. Today, that means getting extra food for Stephen's.
So all the students sitting there are actually from the fluid mechanics group, I think. But my office is the one on the end there, and as you saw, people would write on the tabletops and at tea time. So people write. It was just a very intense environment. You'd go there, and you could go there, and at 3 o'clock in the morning there would always be someone in the tea room. And at tea time, everyone would come out, have some discussions, write your equations on the white table surfaces. The tea lady would come around at the end and wipe them down, and ready for the next time. Or we'd go to lunch. Every day we'd go to lunch, all of us, with Stephen and Gary and whoever else happened to be there, and we'd write equations on the napkins. And that's how it was. It was very intense, just physics all day. I mean, you had to get away from it, sometime go hill walking in Wales, as I think I was doing at this point in time. So you're about to meet Brian. Right. So that was Brian Witt, and Brian and I we worked on very similar things, and Brian was the one who helped write A Brief History of Time. And because, of course, Stephen couldn't type things, and this was actually while he still had his voice, which you can all play it. So I was working basically when Brief History of Time was coming off the printer. They offered Brian £3,000 or a percentage, and £3,000 in those days was as much as a student stipend. So for a PhD student here in New Zealand, if you've got a scholarship, you might get for your living expenses $25,000 a year. So that was the sort of sum it represented. I told him he should always take a percentage, but he took the £3,000. Anyway, so Brian, in his career, he immediately went into software. He didn't continue in physics. So even from this group, there are a lot of people who went and did other things. Here you'll have Stephen.
Are rather ill-informed about ghosts. So I want to tell you what they are.
That
And why you need not be afraid of them. I'm going to talk about the ghosts that arise in high derivative theories.
So that's Stephen talking with his voice as it was about 2 months before he lost it. So, well, I've got a lot of stories about that. I'm just going to move on, give an overview. You can ask me whatever story you want. Ask me anything. Almost. So when Stephen was very ill and thought he was almost died of pneumonia, we had a roster for looking after him in the hospital, reading him Sherlock Holmes and other things to keep his spirits up because he was really depressed. So careers, there are many other careers, and another person I knew at the time was Nathan Myhrvold. He was a postdoc my first year there from 83 to 84, and he was really into computing, and so was his wife, and at one point they decided they would quit, and Stephen was a bit pissed off. So he left after a year, quit halfway through his postdoc and went to Silicon Valley and founded a computer company. A few years later, he came back to visit, and he'd been bought up by Microsoft at that point. Within a year or two, he'd become the director of research at Microsoft. So, and now, for the best part of 2 decades, he was at the top of the organization. So you see him there with Bill, developing bad software, until he decided to form, he's a billionaire in his own right, of course, and decided to form his own company, Intellectual Ventures, and now you can find he's really into the physics of cooking and has grown very fat, and he's got a whole books about the physics of cooking. So there's another completely different career, and the thing is, you always do what you're passionate about. I mean, life is too short to do boring things. Of course, many people have to do boring things, and many people are happy doing boring things, but there are many things you can do, and if you do something like physics and fundamental stuff, you can end up almost anywhere. Some other paths that people from that era, so Raymond Laflamme, who you would have seen that film clip at the back, he worked on quantum cosmology, and he went on to quantum computing. So quantum cosmology, there's not a lot of money in it, but anyone who does quantum cosmology is pretty good at the fundamental concepts of doing things with quantum computers, because there you need an entirely different form of logic, right? And there's a lot of money in it because it's the basis of cryptography. So many people I've known who been doing quantum cosmology. In fact, I even ended up doing quantum cosmology, even though I thought I wouldn't work on it. I did some of that in the end. So my office mate from later, when I was a postdoc, Jason Twomley's also went into that, and Raymond Laflamme is director of quantum computing at Perimeter Institute now. Now, if you're doing your career, then as a physicist or an academic, so I have a lot of experience with academic careers, there's something we call the two-body problem. It's well known in physics, of course, the two-body problem. We can solve it exactly, but in real life, well, at least you can in Newtonian theory, not in general relativity. And the two-body problem of having a normal life, if you marry another academic, is very challenging. So I know nowadays, I know of a couple, one lives in Copenhagen and one lives in Utrecht. They're both professors, and they commute on weekends across, from one country to another. You can do that in Europe. So here we have my office mate, Anna. So she managed to negotiate. So Anna and I, we actually worked on paper together, supersymmetry, and she married a Dutch man, and I married a Dutch woman. And so they managed to negotiate their careers, and they had kids later than us. And now she's in Leiden, where my wife actually was an undergraduate. So they managed it. We didn't. My wife is an archaeologist, and so anyway, she wanted to have kids, and so So she gave up her career for mine, and so I owe a lot to her. And the thing is, when you're a postdoc and traveling around, what's really hard is that you have to go to all these places where you have no support network. And so that is really hard on your spouse. Being an academic, you have to move where the job is, and you have to move from country to country. So my first postdoc, our first daughter was born on my first postdoc in 1988, and then we moved back to the UK. And my second child, I got 4 kids actually, but the second one was born on my second postdoc when I was in Newcastle upon Tyne. In Newcastle upon Tyne, I was a postdoc with Paul Davies, and Paul is very well known as a writer of popular books. And so those are a couple of popular books which I know very well. Well, there's a lot of stories around that too, but anyway, Paul moved to Australia, and I followed Paul to Australia and ended up at the University of Adelaide, where I was for 10 years on soft money. So in Adelaide, there was something called the Mathematical Physics Group, and so if I look at where people have gone in their careers, then a lot of those people went and did other things, even after you've got a PhD. So one typical route was something called the Defence Science and Technology Organisation, DSTO. I had a bit of a moral problem, even if, so you can go there and work on something which is not at all directly on killing people, but I had a few issues with being part of that organisation. I mean, of course, you always want to go on, if you've been thinking about being an academic, then that's what you're aiming for, but it is so hard, at least in theoretical physics, to get a permanent position. Roy Kerr was right on that point. You've got to consider going to other things. So people, again, go into software. One co-author who wanted to be the Dylan Thomas of physics, he thought drinking a lot of wine would help his ideas, and he did all his calculations, and then he looked at them the next morning and decided that wasn't very a good approach, actually. Anyway, he went into wine growing. Now, some of these people actually still do physics. So I've got Explorations in Mathematical Physics. That's a book written by one Don Cox, who is at DSTO, and he still writes to me all the time asking me questions about relativity. So I get these questions with section unclassified and asking all these questions about relativity. So it's still possible to do fundamental things in your spare time as long as you maintain connections with the community. I know another good friend, Julian Barber, who had a very unusual career, supporting himself by translating Soviet journals back in the day and being totally free to work on what he wanted. And he didn't become a crackpot, as it's very easy to do if you're disconnected from the community, because he maintained collaborations and talked to people. So that is possible, but it's harder. So during this time, so our group, a lot of people went away because you come up with funding problems, and in 1996 I just got a 5-year position, and I thought, well, we're as good as settled here, and Annika and I, we actually built a house in Adelaide, because I thought we will surely be here permanently, but then the Howard government cut the funding of the universities, and for various political reasons it got, because the engineers took away our service teaching, physics was badly hit, so a lot of people had to leave, because if you're on soft money, there just weren't the permanent jobs coming. So I went through an existential crisis at that time, and so one of the more unusual friendships that I made was with someone else who had a different career in physics. So she's a feminist physicist science writer. She'd done a BSc, and it was at the time when there was something called the science wars going on. So a physicist by the name of Alan Sokal made a hoax paper about postmodernism, which he got published. And it's a total piss take, and it's really hilarious. But it started off a debate about postmodernism, and I don't know what it was, but Margaret published something in The Australian. She was living in Los Angeles, and so I emailed her some snarky comment saying, the only way that I would be able to get funding, it seemed, would be to sit in my desk and hang a sign, people could come and watch me at the zoo. I'd be a performance artist. But anyway, she wasn't, she was a very different person. I went away and I read her book, Pythagoras' Trousers, and because she was going on about a lot of the people who went on about God and physics and the popular physics genre, and because I knew the two people, Stephen Hawking and Paul Davies, who did most of that, we got into some rather interesting discussions. So I pointed out, for example, that I found it really strange to hear that you have conversations and then you hear your words coming back to you over the radio when they're interviewing Paul. And so anyway, at one point she wrote a piece and said, you should go and read The Australian next. I've got a piece in there, you'll like it. And I read it, and she'd taken all the things that I'd said and all of my own phrases, my little peculiar things, like, I said, you can't, I don't think you can be a feminist if you've got a Y chromosome. So she just took in those little things out and put them, and it was a totally hilarious, weird situation. Someone in Los Angeles is putting something in the Australian, and only you know what she's actually writing about here, the subtext. So there are all these strange situations that you can get into. Right? So I said, because she told me about her next book, and it was, I said, oh, so you're writing a brief history of space. Is that it? And so the subtitle here is A History of Space from Dante to the Internet. So all these strange little things happen to you when you're doing stuff, and you meet interesting people in this line of work. So what about here? Where do our undergraduates end up if you just come out with a BSc? Well, almost anything. So if I look at the graduates, they're in the Met Service, NIWA, teaching, many teachers, electricity companies, electronics, and software, in fact, almost anything. And I think the real thing with the world today is that many of the jobs that you're going to do in the future don't exist yet. Right? So, and if you're thinking about doing the job that doesn't exist yet, you've got to ask not what job am I going to have when I finish. It's not a meal ticket. You have to ask what skills am I going to have, because you have to be adaptable. And the world is changing a lot, and it's changing fast. So I think that's one of the most important things to think about in terms of careers, rather than just looking at a physicist and thinking about ending up as a professor of physics, which I happen to do because I worked very hard and made the grade. But there's a lot of things you can do that are different. Right? So if I look at my own PhD students, well, actually, a few, about half of them have had postdocs. There are, one just became professor in Norway. One's a lecturer, Cindy's a lecturer in Singapore. But some of them went to work in the finance industry, right? So they make a lot of money doing things which probably not always very ethical, but at least Ben Carter always says he doesn't do certain trades, and it's interesting to discuss with them what they're doing. But so there are all many different worlds of possibilities. So I once met the head of the Australian Tax Commission when I was living in Australia. He was a physicist. He said, well, after you've solved Schrödinger's equation, everything else is easy. So you can do whatever you want. You just have to have the right skills. So if you are looking to be numerate, to think from first principles, that's what distinguishes us from what we try to do, as opposed to various parts of engineering. Of course, there are brilliant, very creative engineers as well, but we're always doing the thing first before it becomes an engineering problem. We want to think about how do you use the principles to do something totally new. So we were the first to get into computers. We invented the World Wide Web. That was it was a discovery. It was made at CERN 30 years ago, and we were the first, we were using it before it became what it is today. I was using it very early. I sent my first email in 1986. Anyway, so you just got to have the right skills, and I think we prepare you to think fundamentally from first principles. If you are thinking of a career in this area, in my own particular game, a lot is happening with gravitational waves. So gravitational waves were, of course, first discovered a few years ago now. These are a few of our graduates. So the third one being Alex Nielsen, being my PhD student, the one who's just got a job in Norway. And there are decades of things coming because it's just newly discovered, and we're going to find out a whole lot of things about the universe that we don't know. Because we'll be able to detect things which are not in the electromagnetic spectrum. So the LISA space mission is going to be launched in some years, and that is just going to be truly amazing, and it requires huge teams of people. So one thing about physics collaborations is that at the experimental end, the things are so challenging that you'll have, in gravitational waves, 1,000 people on a paper. I'm very atypical in that as a theoretical physicist, you tend to work in groups of 2 or 3, or even by yourself. And that's very different from most of physics today. So in terms of what I've done, well, I've worked on lots of different things. So the supergravity became black holes and string theory, and I've worked on things called brane worlds and quantum cosmology and fundamentals, black holes, and in the 90s, I became more and more interested in cosmology, and I worked because there was a lot of evidence even before 1997 that the expansion of the universe appeared to be accelerating. So I worked on those ideas, but the more I worked on it and the more I looked at the observations, the more I realized it was actually the universe is not the one that we are describing, because it's very inhomogeneous. There's lots of lumps, there's huge structures, and we're probably doing something very fundamentally wrong, because there are parts of Einstein's equations that Einstein never actually understood or finished and didn't develop properly. And those are the hard problems. And I'm sure that it's related to those hard problems. So since about 2005, I've become the no dark energy guy. Actually, there's more than one of us, but in this, a lot of suspects. So that there are, so the first, at the top left is Thomas Buchert, and the bottom right is me, and various people in between have various different views. The third one of those people is George Ellis. So my work has been in this this infamous rag. New Scientist has been on the cover 3 times in the past decade. So, just to sum up, so what do you want to do as a theoretical physicist? One problem is that people in their careers, many people just out for their career to get fame, recognition, a good salary, all that sort of stuff, and that's fine, but it ends up meaning that I think we have a problem with things like the Nobel Prize is a bad thing for physics, because it doesn't equate with the way that physics is done, certainly in these large collaborations, and it distorts things because everybody is just focused on getting one prize, and it's just a prize. And there's a huge amount of work that is really important, which is not that. What I really enjoy is thinking from first principles in a totally new way. And the most fun I've ever had in my career was I've gone back, so in thinking about the fundamentals of gravitational energy, I went right back to, because there are gaps in relativity, I went back and I redid thought experiment very much like, I sat down and thought, if Einstein was doing this problem, how would he have approached it? And the question is, what is the difference between being at rest in an expanding space and moving in a static space? And there is a certain notion in which those things should be equivalent. So I sat down and I did a thought experiment, and it was so much fun. And the referee report came back within 3 weeks saying, it's very rare that anyone does anything like this. I really emphatically say this should be published. It's blah, 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 blah. And that was just such a lot of fun. And so one of the people who I've got up there is George Ellis, who was co-author with Stephen of that book Hawking and Ellis, the one that I got for my 16th birthday. He's actually the person whose ideas I think have been, in the end, most influential. He was, in fact, in Trieste when I was on my first postdoc, but I was working on silly stuff then, supersymmetry, a lot of string theory stuff, which I don't think is that interesting. It's a missed opportunity. Anyway, the other person there is Yvonne Choquet-Bruhat, and she was a postdoc when Einstein was still there in 1952 or 54, just before Einstein, a year or two before Einstein died. And Einstein didn't let many people into his office because everyone wanted to come and talk to Einstein. So Einstein was very selective in who he let into his office to talk physics with him. And he used to let Yvonne Choquet-Bruhat into his office to talk physics. And in 2009, I got to talk about my work at big conference. And there's always, because so in doing what I'm doing, which is going out on a limb, I'm going against the mainstream. There are people who support us, but I'm going against the mainstream of most of the community, and that's hard. But it hasn't hurt my career. In fact, my career has got a lot better, and I got onto lots of committees and this, that, and the other. So I got to give my work at a big conference in the UNESCO building in Paris, but they still put me last of the plenary talks. So just because, we're not quite sure about this stuff. And so anyway, I gave my talk and described the thought experiment, etc., all this. At the end, this little old lady shuffles down. It was Yvonne Choquet-Bruhat, and she just shook my hand and said, "Congratulations, this is the true spirit of relativity." I thought, well, I know how to think. So, that's all that matters. So these ideas are going to be tested, and in the coming decade, the Euclid satellite mission has the power to do the tests, which will show whether the sorts of things that I'm thinking are right or wrong. And I don't, and when you are in that position, then often people come up to you so very snarky and say, okay, so in 2000 such and such, you're going to collect the Nobel Prize, I guess, mainly because they've never made a prediction themselves. And I don't really care about that. I think the most important thing is just the enjoyment of thinking about stuff and thinking about things differently to ask the right question. So if I'm right or wrong, I don't care. I think, I've done what I want to do, and I want to continue doing it, and it's a great career. Okay, so over to, I'll answer anything.
Thank you so much, Professor. That was great. So we have a floating mic somewhere. Cool. So if you have a question, if you could raise your hand, and Mel will be passing the mic around. And yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Well, we're still... Okay. while you're on the topic, how is the international support or interest in your ideas? How big is that group, or
Oh, it's not.
how can you quantify that?
Well, so it's difficult to say. The first, when people, you talk about your ideas, the first question is, what does everybody else think? Because physicists are very sociologically driven. And then when they realize that actually you've thought about it extremely, extremely deeply, then they say, well, that's interesting, we'll wait and see. So if you're actually trying to shift a paradigm, so I am in the business of actually what Thomas Kuhn calls shifting paradigms, then it's the number of people who take these ideas up at any time is small, but it's different from being. There are many people who are out and out crackpots with totally crazy ideas who no one will listen to. But so fortunately, I'm not in that category. I'm on editorial boards and things like that. But yeah, so the number who actually at this point in time are following this, it's very small. I mean, how much larger it is than this crowd, I don't know. But it's certainly tens of people rather than thousands. And whereas there are thousands in the... Observationalists just want to take data and fit models. The real problem is that there are different communities. There's the theoretical physicists and the observational people, and to be a good theoretical physicist, you just have to have a brilliant idea once, and everybody will forgive all your other crazy ideas. Whereas if you're an observationalist, then it's very, very difficult to make observations because and especially in astrophysics, there are biases, there are all sorts of statistical things. The experiment was done long ago, far away in a distant galaxy, and so much can go wrong. So everyone is really ultra conservative. So in the observational community, if you are spectacularly wrong just once, no one will trust you anymore. So it's a different dynamic. So they want to go to the theorists and say, well, which thing shall we work on? And what you have is all these theorists who don't know anything about observations, working on string theory and brain worlds, all the stuff that I work, it's my background. I know that most of those people know nothing about observations. And I've gone, in the 90s, I started looking more and more at the observations. And so the fact that those communities are so fractured is one of the real things that is stopping progress. It will take some experiments such as the ones that are coming up to be able to convince people. At the moment, there are already lots of things. There are problems with the standard model of cosmology, like the value of the Hubble constant. There are conflicting things. There are a number of things that are conflicting. So there are all these tensions. So, but the thing is that you've got to come up with predictions, and any model which is close to the standard model any model which is going to be successful has to be reasonably close to the standard model, and my model only differs in some predictions by about 1 to 3% at any distance, redshift, and so the differences are very small. But so it takes time, and so in sociology there's always a tipping point, and you don't know what the tipping point is, and I don't know that I'm exactly right, but I'm pretty sure the standard model is wrong.
The great thing is you have clearly the academic freedom here at the university.
Yes,
to do this.
That's right. So, and once you have a permanent job, right? So, and that's one problem with the system today is that as a postdoc, you don't. Well, I've been turned down for funding actually because people say, well, students shouldn't be working on this. So you can for me actually to get money out of the Marsden Fund is I've had been successful twice, but in the last 6 years I've been to the second. So in the first round they throw out 80% of applications. In the second round you get to international peer review, and just with 3 referees you just need one to say to kill it, and bang, you're down. And being doing the stuff that I do, you can always sure there's going to be one who doesn't, and it'll be a sociological reason, such as students shouldn't work on risky things like this, right? Well, actually, my students are being offered postdocs in gravitational wave analysis, so the skills that they are getting are appreciated by a lot of people. I have a student now, she's already been offered postdocs, she hasn't even finished. But you know, as a postdoc, it's very difficult, or it's perceived to be difficult, to work on something which goes against the mainstream, and that's a real problem because there's a huge bandwagon. Because you have these huge collaborations become much more conservative than individual. So I'm lucky because there's just one of me and there are a few other people, and we can actually have the freedom to work with, to the best of your intellectual rigor. I mean, we all know that in mathematical relativity that there's things that Einstein never solved. Luckily for us, he didn't give out equations on slabs of granite at the top of Mount Sinai. There's things that are left unresolved, and there's so much physics yet to be done. It's really exciting.
Could you please just expand a little bit on the cosmological equivalence principle? And what exactly are the observations you were talking about when you said that these future missions will be making in regards to your ideas?
Yeah. I thought I might get asked that, so I brought another talk along. I'll just pick out a few slides out of it. Whoops. I should just go into. So this is just a pop. I gave this to Astronomy Club some while ago. That's what the universe looks like, zooming out, structure. Okay. Okay, so first of all, the Einstein Equivalence Principle 1907 was the idea that you shouldn't be able to tell the difference between a static homogeneous gravitational field and a uniform acceleration. That's not the true gravitational field. So Newton tells us that we're at rest, that the floor is pushing us up, and gravity is pushing us down. Einstein tells us, actually, we're accelerated. The floor is pushing us up, and you feel it. So your real state of motion is free fall, and you can fall down a lift shaft and experience that. He didn't... apparently he talked to someone who'd fallen off a building site because they didn't have spacecraft to do the experiment. So uniform acceleration and a static homogeneous gravitational field are not the real gravitational field. Those are just a choice of coordinates. And in relativity, what's important is so I don't have the other slides. What's important in relativity is the deviation from uniform frames of reference. So the tidal forces, the fact that if I drop 2 apples here, they'll actually fall towards the center of the Earth. And so the gravitational field is related to the curvature of space. Now, so there were many things that Einstein was able to deduce simply on the basis of the strong equivalence principle, such as the redshift of light, gravitational time dilation, a lot of things just follow from that. So, and the strong equivalence principle, which I've not written down here, tells you that you can always get rid of gravity in the neighborhood of a point. So, because essentially, when we understand the structure of space and time are a relational structure between things, and things are better described by a structure in which in which I can always choose a little local frame such that I don't have to think about gravity. So the thing about the coordinate transformations is that regardless of acceleration, I can always transform to a special choice of a local frame in which on some small scale there is no gravity. Now, that all is relating to transformations at a point. An important question which guided Einstein in his quest for a theory of relativity related to something called Mach's principle, and that is, how do we define inertia? And Newton had this idea about absolute space. So actually, I've got another talk which I should probably be giving about the equivalence principle. Newton had the idea that, well, there's this absolute space, and we know that there's an absolute space because if I take a bucket and I rotate it, then the water goes up the sides of the bucket. And Mach said, well, actually, it's really that you have something, a frame of the fixed stars, which is defining that the water is really rotating with respect to that. And if you could take the whole universe and rotate it about the bucket, then the effect should be the same. So, in other words, that the absolute space doesn't exist just because of Newton's bucket, and there is really, in a consistent theory of relativity, there is no such a thing as relativity of matter relative to space, but only of matter relative to matter, and that's something that is actually written in Einstein's paper when he thought about this stuff. So then the question is, well, what is the frame of the fixed stars that is determining, we know there are no fixed stars now, that is determining what we understand in terms of inertial frames in the universe at large? And various people formulated what we should understand of as inertia and Mach's principle. And there was one version due to Hermann Bondi, who's one of the people in Cambridge, actually. And he said that local inertial frames are defined by some suitable average of all the masses and motions in the universe. And in the stuff that I'm doing, that's exactly what we are doing in a universe which is very lumpy. What is the suitable average of all the matter and the motion? Now, so I did this thought experiment. How can I create something which is like the expansion we have in the standard model of cosmology? So imagine the following. If I take a lattice of observers, infinite lattice, and we're each connected to, so there's observers to the right of me and to the left of me and above me and below me in all three directions in a cube, and we are connected to each other by tethers, so like garden hoses on reels, which are infinitely long because you're allowed to do thought experiments like that. And we've arranged things so we're all moving away from each other at a constant rate, so that, and we know how to, and we're just doing this in special relativity in a totally empty universe where there's no, we don't have to worry about general relativity. And I have this lattice of observers and they're all moving in uniformly away from me. Well, that is exactly what we think of in terms of the expansion of the universe in the standard model of cosmology. So in the standard model of cosmology, we imagine that everything expands just as if there is a uniform, featureless fluid with no structure, that you can take all the structures in the universe, so there's huge voids and what we call the cosmic web, and just if you smooth it all out, then the universe is, regardless of all the structure, it's just going to expand uniformly in that way. So if you take such a lattice of observers, then that's exactly what the expansion of a uniform fluid is supposed to be. So now you imagine, okay, we've got brakes on our tethers. So we have these infinitely long tethers and they're reeling out. Now I'm going to apply brakes to the tethers. And we know how to synchronize our clocks because we know how to do special relativity, and we've got computers, and they're all going to apply the same impulse to each tether at the same time because we know everything's fine, we know how to do that. Then what happens? So you get, first of all, you get heat in your brakes. So the kinetic energy of expansion is converted into usable energy, right? So you get heat in the brakes. What else happens? Well, you slow down the expansion. But as long as it's uniform, so there's a force. As soon as you apply something, there's a force. But the force in this direction is exactly balanced by the force in that direction. The force in this direction is exactly balanced by the force in that direction. And the force in this direction is exactly balanced by the force in that direction. So it's still inertial, right? So what this thought experiment constructs is a collective degree of freedom. It's only, so we have deceleration and yet there is no force because there is a collective degree of freedom of the background which is different from just a motion in a single direction. And Einstein's original thought experiments were all to do with motion in a single direction rather than the average of all the structures. So the idea with the cosmological equivalence principle is that when we do averages in cosmology, so I've got a version of it, it's based on the strong equivalence principle, that all the average motions are such that on a suitable scale, and the suitable scale relates to some idea of George Ellis, who thought about something called finite infinity. On a suitable scale, then you can always look at the average motion in terms of such a frame in which you cannot tell the difference between being at rest in an expanding space or moving in a static space, in the sense that this equivalent thought experiment is really about motion in a static space. So you can go on with that thing and then think about decelerating at different rates, and there is a gravitational energy. So if you have two interlocking lattices of observers who decelerate by different amounts, then there has to be a net time dilation. So that's the thing that I'm maintain in what I'm doing is that there is a issue about the calibration of clocks between statistical averages and local observers. And that's the crucial thing about the problem we have with dark energy, is because we're assuming that the statistical description of the expansion of the universe is just measured by one clock, that the universe only has one age. So what I'm doing that's different is the universe no longer has one age. The universe has different ages according to which description of the universe you're thinking about. So that's...
My second part of the question was just, in the upcoming missions,
Yes.
what observations were you thinking would help your idea?
Right. Okay. So we're talking about measurements of the expansion history. And yeah, I didn't come prepared with all of the relevant plots. I don't have the best plot for this. So the thing is that if you look at what we call the expansion history, so you measure distance as a function of redshift, and if you go away and you plot that, then the curves, and you assume that the universe expands by Friedman's equation, that's to say that it expands exactly as if there's no structure in the universe, then you get a certain shape of the curve. And you can test that the curve has that shape by measuring redshift as a function of distance. So we're going to do this with the looking at galaxy surveys and using things such as standard rulers, also with supernova measurements. Now there is an issue there because the standard model is used in reducing the data, and that's a real problem. So those detailed measurements of the expansion history will give a different shape to the curve, and you can quantify that in terms of something which is called the Clarkson-Bassett-Lou test. So it's difficult to, what I can say is so what I can say is you can take, so the curve has a certain shape, and you can, whereas any other curve, and so I have a model which at any redshift differs from the standard model by about 1 to 3%. But overall, over a large range of redshifts, there's quite a difference. And so it looks as if in the standard model there is an amount of matter and an amount of dark energy, and the shape of the curve that I have looks as if it's going from one amount of matter and dark energy at one level, there's no dark energy, but that's what it looks like, then to a different value at another redshift. And those differences you can quantify in terms of a particular statistic, the Clarkson-Bassett-Lou test. And in this diagram here, if you go away and plot data, then you expect that so the thing with the standard model is the curvature of space is the same everywhere and is supposed to be small. In Einstein's theory, there's nothing that tells you that the curvature of space has to be the same everywhere. In fact, we know that matter and geometry are coupled. Right? So what we're doing in our sorts of models, we're allowing the curvature of space to vary. It's just that that's so much more complicated that people don't study that model because it's too hard. And that's the real problem here, is that thousands of people's careers have been built on studying the model, which is simple, and the too hard questions are put away, and no one works on them because it doesn't help your career if you're starting out. So according to the prediction, if the standard model is correct, then this these uncertainties there. So this is not my analysis. This is analysis of other people. So you see some uncertainties there. The standard model prediction should give. So this is a null test of the standard model. It should give something which is within the range of those uncertainties, and that is what the Euclid satellite will be able to discern. The present data and the best fit are in the orange, and the best fit is the blue, and that's not my analysis, that's someone else's analysis. And my prediction is the green curve there. So I have a prediction of, at this redshift, you should see this much difference. And so I'm not the only person, so there's something, so my model is called the timescape cosmology. The brown one is the TARDIS cosmology, right? So any difference from the standard model is going to be, should come out in that test. A real problem is you've got to try and reduce the data without, you need 1,000 supernovae, you need to do it without, reduce the data without assuming the standard model, and that's a thorny issue. So what I have is a prediction of the level at which you should see the standard model violated.
So you said you had some stories about Roy Kerr, and
Yeah, which one do you want?
which one do you have?
Oh, I can. All right. So there's a book in the library. So for his 70th birthday conference, we produced a book, and I'll tell what's in the front of the book. Yeah, it's being recorded. Be careful. I'll tell you just what's in front of the book. Roy was a very laid-back lecturer, and after a while I started writing down one-liners. So one of these was, "Sorry that I'm late. I started giving my lecture, and then suddenly there was another lecturer in the room. I discovered that I was giving a stage 3 lecture to a stage 1 class when I should have been giving a stage 2 lecture here." And he didn't prepare his lectures a lot, and he would ad-lib. And he was always very laid back, and he'd also always go on about the exam. The registry were hassling him for the exam questions, And look, I can't see why the registry need the exams so early. In Texas, we just used to write it on the board in the morning. They keep on hassling me about this. Don't worry. Look, I just rehash the old questions. If you just look at the old papers, look, at least half of the questions are going to be the same, and you've passed, so why worry? And then one day he came in and he was doing one of his calculations which he hadn't prepared, and he was writing all the stuff, and he wrote, "equals mess." He said, "Okay, I've obviously screwed this up. Let's see." And he spent, yeah, look there, 12 lines ago. I screwed up a fact of CT. Look, at this point, I'd just go off to the pub. I'm not going to bother doing all that again. Why don't you just take down a note, "The stupid bastard screwed up the CT." So there are many more stories like that, but then it came to the actual exam. And a girl went out halfway through crying. Well, I shouldn't have said that. it was clear that he had just submitted it at very late to the registry, and he hadn't actually checked the answers. So it was fine. You put in the numbers, and it was just very, very, very hard. So you ended up with all the stuff, and there was really, really hard numbers and it was really challenging. And there was one question I thought, this is not soluble. So I wrote, equals mess. I can't be bothered doing this exam. I had analysis yesterday and it's taken everything out of me. But if I was to proceed, this is the method I would use. And that was the correct answer because it was insoluble. So, yeah.
So you've worked with well, or under Professor Stephen Hawking. Could you tell some interesting stories about him?
Yeah. Okay, let's think. Well, he liked to dance in his wheelchair. He was, I mean, it was very hard to understand him because you heard his voice there. That was before. So, and I found that very frustrating because, and he didn't like your aunts finishing his sentences. So one time, and I could understand him if he was talking about physics because you knew what to expect. But one time he wanted a lift to Heathrow Airport and he yelled, right. I counted, he has to ask me 17 times before I understood it was, do you drive? And he was just getting more and more frustrated. So it was, he was always very cheeky. There are a lot of stories I can't tell. Yeah, okay, well. Right. So, because he would use his, so sometimes, because people had to translate for him, and so sometimes he said things, and Stephen, could you please repeat that? Various. I mean, Stephen was not politically correct, so if he had a statement like, "Could I swap my wife for yours?" Someone would. Oh, it's recording. Oh. You have to edit this. Limited release. Stephen was always very cheeky, and he had a sense of humour. So you need a sense of humour when you're in that sort of condition. One story, I know I've had it from both sides. Someone ran, so a job was being offered, and so someone rang up Stephen for a phone reference, which, well, and yeah, and because it was Stephen's former student who was being for a lectureship, and Stephen replied, so-and-so is the best, it was very slow, the best physicist in the United Kingdom, in his field, in his age group, who has applied for this job. And I know that's true because I've had it from both sides. I repeated, I did my fact checking. I ran it past the person who was at the other end of the phone. So yeah, he would, and he would always. Well, once he got his voice, everything changed, and while he was still. When he didn't have any voice, when he had the tracheotomy, so in fact it was about a couple of months after that clip in that, so you can find all those videos. There's huge amounts of videos. Which made life there very interesting, because there were always these film crews coming through, and I remember one. We were having our little lunchtime seminar just as in that one, and there was a French film crew in, and they were shuffling around, and Gary got so upset with them. Look, this is a scientific seminar. Please leave. And then 5 minutes later, this camera pops up, and there's this ditch. So they'd gone around outside, and there's sort of a big ditch, and they had to scale the wall, and this little camera pops up through the window. So there were, I mean, it was a very unreal experience. And this was before he was, a star on The Simpsons and things like that. It was, I mean, the voice changed a lot of things, and it meant that you'd always get, sorry about my American accent, all the time. So we worked in that. So that tea room that you saw, our offices were on one side and Stephen's office was on the other, and it was always a continual stream of visitors. Everyone, I mean, it's like being in the centre the main centre of the universe in gravity, and everybody came to visit him and were sorry about my American accent all the time. But he then tailored that for his jokes. So he had a female voice too, which he had put on for the nurses. So one day it was Shirley Bassey came to visit. So there were always people, famous people, they want to come and visit Stephen, and he tried to get rid of her. Eventually let her come and visit, and we had the first Macintosh computer, and that she got so fascinated with the Macintosh computer, and that kept her occupied for a while. Well, I mean, he has run over people's toes when they were, people he didn't get on with. People who visited conference. He did, and he could be pretty terrifying at times. So Jonathan, the one who did work on, of the two of us, the one who did go to work on quantum cosmology with Stephen then. One point, Jonathan accidentally deleted a few pages of the paper they were working on, and Stephen just got in his wheelchair and cornered him. And so, yeah. I mean, there are lots and lots of stories, but so the time that he lost his voice, we had to use this board. He had no voice. He'd had pneumonia, and the only way to communicate with them, we had a board with letters, and you move your finger around, point to a letter, and then you'd get and then it was always try and guess the. So I remember one time it was new NEWSP, and the nurse was news spoon. And I said newspaper, and yes. So it's like playing game, trying to guess the word to make things go a bit faster. That was always the thing. It was just so slow. I mean, when he got the voice, he was always making jokes in his lectures. In preparing this lecture, I had to read a book I wrote a long time ago. I didn't know how good it was. It's probably because that was a bit written by George Ellis. That was the If time travel were possible, I can't remember what it was. Anyway, if that would, so in a lecture he gave about the chronology protection conjecture, I remember if that were possible, you could make a killing on the stock exchange. So he turned his jokes into adapted his jokes to his voice. It was, anyway. Yep. Right. Any others?
So this is more of an academic and career questions, but what steps would you suggest an undergraduate student take to get involved in research within mathematical physics and theoretical physics? Because it seems like it's much more difficult than getting into experimental physics in terms of the amount of stuff you need to know.
Well, you just have to study hard. Think for yourself. I mean, you have to go to a good place and choose a good supervisor. So a lot. It's always best to. Clearly, you have to get to a good school and choose a good supervisor. And I think one important thing is choosing a supervisor who's got time for you. So I know a lot of people who just want to go and work with someone because they're famous, and that's not necessarily the best supervisor. What you've got to do is to find someone who's going to be famous in 5-10 years. So a lot of people I've known in my career, I mean, someone like Paul Kelly, he's not famous he's famous in New Zealand, but he was just the local physics lecturer. I didn't know he was going to end up being famous. Someone here is going to be famous, I'm sure. But you know, the thing is, you just, it is difficult. So you should have a plan B, right? You might. You just got to get the grades and do the work. It's competitive. So in something like condensed matter physics, you're competing with industry for jobs, and so there's more money for applied research, and so it's certainly easier to get a job. But yeah. You just got to put in the hard yards, and it has to be for you. I mean, it's really a commitment. Yeah, I can't. It's no easy answer to that, other than study hard and I mean, don't just study. Have a life. But, yeah.
Thank you so much. I think we have time for just one more question. Anyone have any more questions? Yeah.
Just to go back to the real basics, what do you think about the influx of students, what their skills in maths and physics are when they come from secondary school? And how does that compare to your days, if you could?
Well, it's different because the world is full of computers now. There are difficulties with our education system. So I think so. My son, he had to do a lot of stupid stuff at school. Doing adding up numbers by different strategies instead of learning basics of algebra at an early age. So I think
What level are you talking about?
in primary school. So there's a lot of I think there are a lot of problems with the math education. Now, every generation always says, "Oh, things was much better in my day," and so I don't want to look at it purely like that. I mean, I get students doing my course, and they're as bright as they ever were. So many of them survive the whatever. But I think our generation were lucky. And we had what they called new maths. We learnt set theory when we were 6 years old or something. That was, and it was the time just the moon. It was when in the United States they were realised the Russians were beating them and they wanted to put people on the moon. And so there was suddenly this drive for let's be strong in science. And I think we had the benefit of that. And that since then, because there's so much computing technology that computers can take over doing things, but you actually need to be mathematically literate and to do practice. And say if you want to be a mathematical physicist and you don't know how to do integrals, you should be doing 10 integrals before breakfast, because you want to be an athlete, you've got to train, right? So if you want to be a mathematical physicist, you got to train, just because you've got to be able to do that stuff really fast and really quickly. And certainly in our schooling system, the emphasis on the gymnastics of it, of being able to calculate quickly, and is there's not enough of that. Yeah, abstract thinking, algebra, and all that sort of stuff. It's not emphasised enough in the current curriculum, and that's a real problem. And I've seen really interesting pieces of technology that people are trying to develop apps to teach kids in schools to do algebra in intuitive ways, the way that we feel. So you swipe things to rearrange equations, and so those. I mean, it would be great to see those things put in to teach you, because one real problem is that a lot of people turn off because everyone gets maths at their own pace and different rates, and it's not, it's just logic, right? And so it's not, if taught well, then it's not a problem. It's just that there are many people who feel uncomfortable with maths, and then they don't teach it well, and then another generation and don't do it, and people always say, I was very successful but I was lousy at mathematics, so why do you need it? But well, I mean, you do need it for the modern world.
And what about physics? Is there anything specific lacking? When I came to New Zealand, what my was very surprised about is that there's no gas laws in secondary school physics. Maybe in chemistry, but
there was in chemistry, at least when I went, and we had in physics too. I think we mainly got in chemistry, but
I'm teaching physics here, and
right,
there's no gas laws in there.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Do you notice any deficiencies that you kind of?
Well,
you repair it anyway.
We try to repair it. It's harder to try and repair maths, because maths it's like reading. It's a basic skill that the better you have it early through practice, the easier it is. So physics is about concepts, and and physics teaching involves getting students to get rid of their misconception about something. So I think physics is easier to repair than bad mathematics.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor David Wiltshire, so much on behalf
Okay.
of the New Zealand Student Space Association, Christchurch, and the audience members here. We would like to thank you so much for your time and your presentation and answering all the questions.
Okay, good.
As a token
Okay,
of appreciation,
right.
we have a card
Okay.
for you.
Okay, thank
Signed
you.
by you, and
Thanks.
some chocolates, and we have a mug
Okay.
with our
Oh,
logo
excellent.
on it.
Right, thank you. Okay, thank you.
Thank you again so much.
Right.